At the time that the Gorgias takes place, Socrates had already developed a reputation for doing the kind of thing that he's doing in the Gorgias. And this is clear from the way Polus interacts with him. Socrates had developed, so that is to say, Socrates had developed a reputation for going around asking people questions and refuting them, getting them to contradict themselves. And so the people there, Polus and Callicles at the very least, the Athenians there, would have known who Socrates was. It's clear they know who he is, and they know what he does. And so when Polus enters the conversation, what he wants to do is flip the tables on Socrates. Socrates, I know you do this kind of thing all the time. This is what you always do. You go around, you ask people questions, you get them to trip themselves up. That's really easy to do. I'm going to ask you the questions now, Socrates, right? That's Polus. That's how he proceeds. And so he then asks Socrates, okay, fine, Socrates, what do you say that rhetoric is? And this leads Socrates to give his account of rhetoric. He doesn't reply, he doesn't give an argument against Gorgias's account, but Socrates' account of rhetoric is very, very different from Gorgias's. And we'll have an opportunity to see how exactly it's different. Socrates' account is there's like a big long speech he gives, and there is just a million details crammed into it. What we're going to try to do now is unpack some of those details and understand what exactly he's saying. Because your first time reading through Socrates' account of rhetoric, you're going to have no idea what he's talking about. This is all this he talks about: pastry baking and cosmetics and legislation, and there are images of things, and it's just all this stuff that's thrown at you in quick succession. And one of the things that's, I think, revealing of Polus's character is that it's very clear that Polus didn't understand all these details. Yet, instead of asking any questions about it, instead of prodding Socrates' account, trying to clarify it, trying to get Socrates to say a little bit more about it, Polus just moves on to the next topic. He doesn't understand what Socrates just said any better than we do, and yet Polus just charges on ahead. Right? He picks up on the fact that Socrates takes kind of a dim view of rhetoric, and he focuses on that. What we're going to try to do things a little bit better than Polus does. We're going to try to understand what exactly Socrates is saying. So in the first place, Socrates claims that rhetoric is a knack and that it's not a craft. We're going to talk about what exactly that means, what exactly the stuff about craft means, and so on in detail in just a second. But here at the outset, you can see that he's going to disagree with Gorgias's account. According to Gorgias, rhetoric is a craft. What exactly that entails, we'll see in just a second. So here at the outset, a central difference between Socrates and Gorgias and their accounts of rhetoric. In the second place, the second part, so there are two parts to Socrates' account of rhetoric. The second part, he claims that rhetoric is an image of the craft of justice. Now, both of these, it's kind of unclear what exactly they mean. Maybe the first one, at least, okay, I can kind of, rhetoric is a knack. I know what a knack is, I guess. It's not a craft. I don't know. But the second one, rhetoric is an image of the craft of justice. What on earth does that mean? That is not clear at all. So we'll spend some time trying to understand what exactly that means. But let's take these in order. Let's start with the first one. Rhetoric is a knack. It's not a craft. Now, if you think about it for 1 second, you'll realize, right, and hopefully you've realized this already, the Gorgias itself was not written in English. And so craft is a translation of a Greek word. Yeah. And it's not a very good translation. This is a problem when you read Greek philosophy that you run into a lot. There just are not very good translations for a lot of words. And it's not a problem with the translator himself. It's just that there's no word that really captures that Greek word. There's no English word that really captures that Greek word. That Greek word is techne, right? And so when Gorgias says that rhetoric is a craft, he's saying rhetoric is a techne. And when Socrates says it's not a craft, he's saying it's not a techne. So what exactly is a techne? Well, craft is certainly one translation of it, but craft, I don't know, maybe it's me, but when I think of crafts, I tend to think of, making, kids making necklaces out of macaroni, or, gluing what do kids glue macaroni onto sheets of paper. I don't know what kids do, right? But that kind of stuff. I should probably know what kids do. I have a bunch of kids, but those kind of art projects, or making baskets or whatever, right? That's what you think of when you think of crafts, and that's not what they're talking about. Perhaps some better translations would be something like art, or skill, or expertise. Science is even a possible translation of techne. Science, so craft, art, skill, science, expertise, mastery of some subject area, right? A techne, a craft, is a kind of specialized mastery. It's an achievement, right? And so by claiming that rhetoric is a techne, Gorgias is kind of elevating it. And by denying that it's a techne, Socrates is kind of demoting it or devaluing it, right? I think this aspect of what's going on here is best captured by the English word science. So often enough, we say things, oh, well, that's a science. That's like a way of saying it's like serious, right? That's like a real legitimate discipline. Where you say, oh, that's not a science. That's a way of saying it's not a real legitimate discipline. So this happened kind of very famously earlier in the 20th century with psychology. And so psychologists would kind of ardently maintain that psychology was a science, a legitimate, true science. It's a science. Whereas critics of psychology would say, no, it's not a science. It's a pseudoscience, for example. Philosopher of science named Karl Popper very famously claimed this, right? It's not a science. That's a way of kind of demoting it, of saying it's not really that serious of a cognitive discipline, something like that, right? And so something like that is what's going on between Gorgias and Socrates. Gorgias saying, yeah, rhetoric, it's like a science. It's like a serious cognitive discipline. And Socrates saying, no, it's not. It's not a technique. Now, dig a little bit deeper into this notion of, and so whenever you see that word craft in our translation, it's translating this word techne. And so keep that in mind. This is what they're talking about. Examples of technes include like kind of uncontroversial examples. Would include something like medicine. Medicine is a paradigmatic example of a techne in the Greek world. Everyone would agree that medicine is a techne. It's a kind of subject matter. It's a science, right? It's something you have to learn. It takes a long time to learn, right? This is part of being a techne too. You have to like go to school. You have to spend a lot of time studying in order to learn these things, in order to master these things. Other examples of techne would be various branches of mathematics. Geometry was a techne. They would call geometry and arithmetic technes, right? And they're like, and they're sciences. They're arts, if you will, or sciences would probably be the closer to the English, right? The science of geometry. There's a way that things proceed, and you have to know how they work, and there's a knowledge of that subject area. But then also things like carpentry. Carpentry is a techne, right? It's knowing how to, if you're like making furniture or whatever, right? That person, it's like an art, the art of carpentry. And it's takes time. You can't just sit down at a saw and know how to make a table or whatever. You have to learn, and it's a specialized mastery. Yeah. All right, let's focus on medicine as our example. So a paradigmatic example of techne is medicine. And the person who possesses this techne would, of course, be the doctor, right? The doctor is the person who's mastered the skill of healing people. And what Socrates would want to say, what he kind of alludes to in the Gorgias, is that what makes medicine a techne and what makes the doctor a possessor of a techne is that the doctor knows how the body and diseases and medicines all interact with one another. And so they know why this particular medicine will heal that particular person with this particular disease. They know how all of those things interact, and they can explain why certain treatments will lead to health, right? Socrates highlights the knowledge of explanations as being crucial, of primary essential importance for a techne. That's the mark of being a techne. Having this kind of knowledge of explanations, knowing why the things that the techne deals with happen the way that they do, knowing why this medicine will treat that disease, and so on, right? Being able to give an explanation of something like that. That's the mark of a techne. Doctors have that. And look, it's a cognitive achievement. It's a specialized mastery. You got to go to school for like 1,000,000 years in order to get it and pay, $5 million. I don't even know how much it costs. Not $5 million, but it costs a lot of money, right? Specialized mastery. And it's a science, right? It's an expertise and so on. Now, what I want to contrast techne with is a knack. So Socrates says techne, or says rhetoric is not a techne, it's a knack. Well, what exactly does that mean? Contrast the doctor who possesses the techne of healing people with your parents, assuming your parents are not doctors, right? I know many of your parents probably are doctors or whatever, but assume they're not. Okay. Your parents then do not possess the techne of medicine. But look, they might very well be able to heal you nonetheless. So let's say when you were sick or whatever, and your parents were taking care of you, they would, have you sit in bed and make you soup and you drink tea with honey in it and whatever else, right? All these kind of homemade remedies. Now, let's say those things actually work. I don't know if they do or not. I don't know. Assume they do, though, right? Assume that whatever, eating soup and drinking soup, I don't know what you do with soup. Assume soup actually heals you when you're sick. Yeah. Well, look, your parents then, they can actually heal you when you're sick, right? They know how to heal somebody. They give them these kinds of treatments. They, have this soup, rest in bed, and don't do anything or whatever. But they don't know why any of that stuff works. What Socrates would say is that they simply have a knack for healing from their past experience, right? When your older brother got sick, they tried giving him, a big old steak and that didn't work. He just threw that out or whatever. And so I'll try soup or whatever, right? Oh, that works. And now he feels a lot better, right? Whatever, right? From kind of past experience, they simply know that, well, these things work, or, they've learned it from their parents and from the experience that they had from their parents and so on. Right? Simply from past experience, they see that these kinds of treatments make people feel better, but they have no idea why. They don't know how diseases work. They don't know why soup would interact with the disease in this or that way, or interact with your body in this or that way and make you better. They have no idea. They can't explain it at all, right? And so that's the difference between a techne and a medicine, or a techne and a knack, according to Socrates. Knacks, they might be effective at achieving a particular goal. So in this case, healing. But what's characteristic of a knack is that there's no understanding of why, right? And what's characteristic of a techne is this understanding of why. So, what what Socrates is saying, rhetoric is a knack, it's not a craft. Rhetoric doesn't understand why certain rhetorical tricks work. So one rhetorical trick, the only rhetorical trick that I know of by name, is the rule of three. If you put things in series of threes, people remember it better. Veni vidi vici, right? I came, I saw, I conquered, whatever, right? And there's a whole bunch of other ones like this that at the moment I'm blanking on, but you'll notice it. If you have this in mind, you just see things, you'll notice it. For whatever reason, threes stick in people's minds. And so that's like a rhetorical trick. You put things in a series of three, people will remember it better. And so that's something that Gorgias might teach you to do. But Gorgias has no idea why that works. He just knows that it does on the basis of past experience, right? And so that's the idea that Socrates is getting at here. Rhetoric, it's more of like a knack. It's not a science. It's not a craft, right? It's not techne. And so now we know what that means, right? Check. But this second aspect of Socrates' kind of rhetoric, it's an image of the craft of justice. That's even the harder one. And we still have no idea what that means. And Socrates spends the majority of his time trying to explain this. So let's look at what he's doing. Now, this is going to get kind of complicated because Socrates introduces this whole kind of systematic view of all these different crafts and all these different knacks, and he relates them in this very kind of neat correspondence. And it's very easy to get lost in this, especially if you're just reading it. I mean, it just is going to go in one ear and out the other, or in one eye and out your brain. I don't know. So let's slow down and see how it all works. So Socrates starts off with this notion of a craft that's concerned with the human good, a techne that's concerned with the human good. Socrates thinks there's a bunch of sciences, right? So physics is the science of, I don't know, matter or energy. Biology is the science of life. And carpentry is the craft of woodworking. I don't know. Cobbling is the craft of making shoes, whatever, right? Well, Socrates says, there are some crafts or sciences or techniques, whatever you want to call them, that are going to be concerned not with matter and energy, not with life, but with the human good, with what's good for human beings. Okay, fair enough, Socrates. What Socrates notes at this point is, well, look, human beings have kind of two aspects to them, two parts, it's unclear what exactly they are, body and soul. He doesn't argue for this at all. He doesn't go into any kind of detail about it. And so what I would say, for the sake of understanding what Socrates is up to, just grant that to him. If you want to say, no, there's just the body, there is no soul, or why think there's a soul, or that seems a little bit strange to just assume that, or whatever, there's just nothing here to satisfy those kinds of interests you might have. We're going to talk about these things later, especially when we get to someone like Aristotle. But for now, just grant it to Socrates. Fine, body and soul. Yeah. And so what Socrates says is there's going to be a craft, or there are going to be crafts concerned with the good of the soul, and there are going to be crafts concerned with the good of the body, right? Because there's crafts concerned with the human good. Human beings have these two aspects, and so there are going to be crafts concerned with the goods of those two aspects. Focus first on, eventually this is all going to come back around to rhetoric, and the fact that rhetoric is an image of justice. We'll get there when we get there, though, right? Okay, so focus first on crafts concerned with the good of the body. Techne is concerned with the good of the body. What is the good of the body? What does that even mean? Well, that's kind of easy. The good of the body is health, right? That's what makes a body be in a good condition. That's what good bodies are. They're healthy, right? So that's the good of the body. So there are crafts, then, technes, concerned with the good of the body. And Socrates mentions two. There is gymnastics on the one hand and medicine on the other. Gymnastics, that's what on earth does that mean? He doesn't mean tumbling around on a mat and throwing a baton up in the air and balancing on a beam and that kind of stuff. What he means by gymnastics is physical training, right? And so physical training is a kind of craft There's like a expertise, a skill, an art there. There's an art to physical training. And you go to a physical trainer, and they know how to make bodies healthy, how to make them strong and healthy in the first place. They know how to generate health in the body, right? Do these exercises, eat this diet, and so on, right? And so gymnastics or physical training is a craft that generates health in the human body in the first place. Right? And so that's the sense in which it's concerned with the good of the body. It's concerned with health. On the other hand, there's medicine. So when a healthy human body strays from that good condition, becomes unhealthy, right? You break a bone or you contract a disease, right? And so your body falls away from this condition of health. Well, there's a craft for that. Medicine restores bodies to a state of health, restores goodness in the body, right? And so you break your bone, you go to the doctor sets the bone and says, don't use it for, I don't know, a month, and you do that, and your bone, you're fixed. You're back to normal, right? You're healthy again. So doctors bring us back to a state of health. That's the idea. Right, so those are the crafts that are concerned with the good of the body, according to Socrates. Okay, turn now to crafts concerned with the good of the soul. Well, what is the good of the soul? That's a lot harder to say. Good of the body, that's kind of easy. Health, okay, fine. Everyone can agree about that. But what is the good of the soul? What's the good condition of a soul? What's the analog to health, right? There's a healthy body, but what's a healthy soul? According to Socrates and the Greek tradition more generally, health of the soul is virtue. The good of the soul is virtue. And so there are going to be crafts, just as there are crafts concerned with health, there are going to be crafts concerned with virtue. And Socrates claims that those crafts that are concerned with virtue, we have a name for them: politics. That might seem really bizarre. Why on earth would you call those politics? Politics is concerned with the soul. Politics is concerned with putting virtue in the soul. This just seems way different from our notion of politics, yeah? We'll talk about this more in detail as we proceed through the Gorgias. But he does the same thing here as he did in the case of the crafts concerned with the good of the body. He breaks it down into two different sub-crafts: legislation and justice. So what exactly does he remind here? He doesn't go into any kind of detail about this. And so a lot of this is going beyond what Socrates actually says. But there's supposed to be an analogous relationship between legislation and gymnastics. There's supposed to be an analogous relationship between justice and medicine. And what that means is that that just as gymnastics generates health in the body, so too legislation generates virtue in people's souls. And just as medicine restores health to people's bodies when they've fallen away from it, justice restores virtue to people's souls when they've fallen away from virtue. Focus on legislation. Socrates' idea here, and this is an idea of the ancient Greeks more generally, and so he's not, people would have understood him without much further explanation, right? But Socrates' idea here is that legislation, we have laws. Laws kind of educate us into how we're supposed to behave. And so we have laws that prohibit certain kinds of behavior and that would reward or encourage other kinds. And Socrates' view and the ancient Greeks' view here, or a lot of the ancient Greeks' view here, was that the point of the laws, the point of encouraging and prohibiting certain kinds of behavior, was to make citizens better people, to make them more virtuous, right? And so we prohibit vicious activities because we want people to be better. And so the laws are a kind of education into virtue, and they require us to cultivate the virtues on threat of punishment, right? You break the law, you get punished. You don't want to get punished, and so you behave a certain way, right? That's Socrates' view. And so it generates virtue in the soul in the first place. But laws, just they're not, just because you have a law against murder doesn't mean no one will ever murder, right? People still break the law. Well, when that happens, then it's time, then we need to make use of this second craft concerned with the good of the soul, justice. And what Socrates has in mind here is something like the justice system, right? So yeah, you have a law that prohibits a certain kind of behavior, but somebody nonetheless breaks the law. They've fallen away from virtue. Well, now they need to go to a court, right? And Socrates' idea here is that what justice does is it sets down a penalty, a punishment, and by being punished, by paying the penalty, that's a way of rehabilitating your soul, of introducing virtue back into your soul, right? Of restoring your soul to a state of virtue. Right? And so it works analogously to medicine. In the same way that medicine restores your body to health, justice, right? The justice system, courts, being punished, paying the penalty, restores your soul back to virtue, right? That's how these crafts concerned with the human good work. Okay, fair enough. Now, what we're going to see is a mirroring of this structure, because there's something which Socrates calls flattery. Flattery is not a techne, it's a knack. And it's a knack that's concerned not with the good, not with the human good. It's a knack that's concerned with pleasure. And so up above, legislation, justice, gymnastic, medicine, all these techniques concerned with the human good, they're aimed at the good in their particular ways. They're aimed at the human good. Flattery, and there are going to be 4 different kinds of flattery, are not aimed at the human good. They're not aimed at the good at all. They're aimed at producing pleasure. Okay. Moreover, what Socrates claims is that flattery is an image of the techne concerned with the human good. Well, what on earth does that mean? Image in this context means something fairly specific. Now, across Plato's works, he uses the concept of image a lot, and he does a lot of different things with it. And in some places, it kind of has a positive connotation. Images of things help you learn about the things of which they are images. They give you information about the things. They are ways into that thing of which they are images. And so images can be kind of helpful conduits of further information, something like that. But in other places, image can have a kind of negative aspect or connotation. And in this passage from the Gorgias, it has a negative connotation. Because an image can also be what you could be emphasizing, and what Plato is emphasizing here. When one thing is an image of another, it's kind of deceptive. The one thing looks like the other thing, but it's not the other thing. They're different. So, for example, let's say you're a very dutiful son or daughter, and you have a portrait painted of your parents, and you hang that up in your room now, and whatever, and that painting is an image of your parents. It looks like your parents. Yeah. In calling it an image, however, what we might be emphasizing, and what Plato is really emphasizing here, is that, yeah, fine, it kind of looks like your parents. And if you stumble in your room late at night and you've had a few too many to drink or whatever, I don't know. You might look at it and think, mom and dad. Oh, no, it's not them. It's just the painting, right? You might actually mistake the painting for your parents. Yeah, right? And there's something deceiving about it. But in reality, they are totally, totally different. They aren't at all the same. That's what Plato's emphasizing, right? In reality, your parents, I assume, are made of flesh and blood and organs and hair and whatever, everything else, right? All the stuff that makes up a human being. That's what they're made of. That painting is made of canvas and pigments and oil and wood, right? The stretcher bars and whatever. Nothing at all like your parents. And so the image, the painting looks like your parents, but in reality, it's radically different. It's not at all like your parents. Yeah. That's the sense in which flattery is an image of the techne concerned with human good. It could deceive you into thinking that it's the same thing. Flattery, and these various kinds of flattery that we're going to get to in a second, might look like they're concerned with the good, but in reality, they aren't at all. They're radically different, right? They might look like they're concerned with the good for human beings, but in reality, they're concerned merely with pleasure. Something like that is the idea. So, Socrates proceeds to divide flattery along the same lines that we divided the techne concerned with the human good. And so there's an image of the craft concerned with the good of the body. There's no name for that, right? He just calls it the image of the techne concerned with the good of the body, right? A big, long mouthful of things. And then there's also an image of the craft concerned with the good of the soul, or that is to say, there's an image of politics. And then these subdivide along similar lines. So focus first on the image of the craft concerned with the good of the body. He says that those knacks subdivide into cosmetics and pastry baking. And so cosmetics is a knack for producing pleasure. Pastry baking is a knack for producing pleasure. Socrates' idea here. So how exactly does this work? Take pastry baking. We're going to compare pastry baking and medicine. And to see how this comparison works, let me say just a little bit about medicine. Greek medicine, as you might imagine, was somewhat primitive compared to contemporary medicine. And Greek medicine, there were basically two things that they would do. They would either, I guess three things. They'd either cut something off. Right? That's one thing that Greek doctors would do, right? Cut off your arm or whatever. They would burn you, right? So, cauterize a wound, something like that. Yeah, they would do that. That was the second thing. And if they cut off your arm, presumably they might try to cauterize the stump or whatever. So two things: cut something off, burn you, or three, prescribe a diet. And this is, analogous somewhat to taking medicine, because the diets they prescribed were not just like, cut down on salt and eat more vegetables. It wasn't like that. It was like, eat only flour or something or whatever, right? Eat only whole wheat for 2 weeks. Just crazy stuff, gross stuff. They tended to not be good. Nobody liked going on these diets, right? Okay, so they'd give you food to eat. And that was by and large mostly what they did, right? They'd tell you, go eat this, don't eat that. And, nobody liked doing it. Okay, fine. Well, look, pastry bakers. And so then the idea here would be they'd give you a diet. They'd tell you to eat this gross, disgusting stuff. Why? For health. It was aimed at health. Assume the diets actually worked for the sake of the example. Assume these diets actually would generate health. Okay, restore you to health. Okay, fine. And so they would tell you what to eat. Well, look, pastry bakers also give you things to eat. But what do they give you to eat? I don't know, like donuts and things like that, yeah? Those things aren't healthy for you at all. They're very pleasant. They taste really yummy or whatever, right? But they're bad for you. And so pastry baking, it kind of looks like medicine. Why? Well, because they're giving you something to eat, right? Eat this. In the same way that the doctor says, eat this, so the pastry baker says, eat this. Yeah. And so there's a kind of similarity there. It kind of looks the same. But in reality, it's totally different, because the diet that the doctor gives you is aimed at your health, whereas the diet, so to speak, that the pastry baker gives you is aimed at pleasure. and it's actually inimical to your health. Yeah. And so pastry baking is an image of medicine. It kind of looks the same because they're both giving you things to eat, but in reality, it's radically different. And then the same thing could be said of cosmetics. I don't know. This is a weird thing about, it's not just the Greeks, but you read older stuff, medieval, I think even the Romans, they got a hang up about makeup. I don't know what exactly it is. But so Socrates is kind of like taking a dim view of cosmetics, right? It's something that kind of produces a pleasant appearance. And so it might look like it makes someone healthy, makes your body more attractive, makes your body look better. But it's really just aimed at pleasure, and it doesn't produce health at all, right? And so that's essentially what cosmetics is, an image of physical training or an image of gymnastics. It's aimed at pleasure, not at actual goodness. I think the easiest, clearest example is the pastry baking and medicine one. That's why I went on at some length about it. And it's going to help us understand what we're actually interested in, which is over on the left-hand side, right? The image of politics breaks down into two subdisciplines, sophistry and rhetoric. And so sophistry is supposed to be an image of legislation. How exactly that works, Socrates does not explain in any kind of detail. But sophistry was another kind of practice, knack that Socrates was opposed to, and he, in many dialogues, debates with sophists and shows them that they don't know what they're talking about. Why exactly sophistry, or how exactly sophistry is in? So when we, there's a lot you can go into here. I'll try not to go into it at all. But when we use the word sophistry, if you hear that word in English, it just means someone who's like arguing in a kind of inconsistent way, right? In a way that doesn't actually work. And they're just trying to confuse people, maybe. It's just tripping people up or something like that. But it doesn't actually work or make sense. That's not really what it means here. Sophists were a particular kind of person. They were teachers, kind of like Gorgias. And Gorgias himself was also a sophist. They were people who would go around Athens or go around the Greek world claiming to teach about virtue. They would teach you how to be virtuous. And so you can kind of see then a link between sophistry and legislation. Legislation was supposed to make people virtuous. Sophists claimed that they would do that. What Socrates is saying here is that no, they're radically different. Sophistry is really just aimed at pleasure or something like that. Okay, fine, whatever. What really interests us is the claim that rhetoric, right, is a knack for producing pleasure, and that it's going to be an image of justice, right? So sophistry is an image of legislation. Rhetoric is an image of justice. And so you can see how these two structures map onto one another. Yeah, they're isomorphic. There's a fancy word for you. They have the same structure. Rhetoric is an image of justice. There's the claim that we're looking for, right? All of this stuff, all these different divisions, talking about blah, 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 everything that Socrates is meant to get at this claim. And so what exactly does it mean? It's an image. It kind of looks the same, but it's radically different, right? That's what's crucial to this claim about its being an image. It kind of looks the same, but it's radically different. So those two parts. So let's focus on those two parts. Rhetoric is an image of justice. It kind of looks the same. How is that? Well, look, justice, as we were talking about it earlier, that's like what happens at courts and things. So somebody brings a suit against you, charges you with something, and we've talked about this at length now. Somebody, charges you with impiety or whatever, or corrupting the youth. Well, now we're in a court setting. And what Socrates would say, well, what's really important is that the craft of justice be exercised. But look, I don't know, when you're thinking about, isn't this the time to use my rhetoric? Right? It looks like when I'm at court, what I should be doing, what I should be using is rhetoric, right? Rhetoric and justice deal with the same kind of thing. They both seem to be, right? They both claim to be what should be operative, when you've been charged with something or you're charging somebody else with something. Right? So that's the sense in which rhetoric kind of looks like justice. Right? You've been charged with something. Yeah, it looks like rhetoric or justice, right? Right? In the same way that the pastry baker recommends things for you to eat, and the doctor, and the doctor does as well, so too, rhetoric kind of suggests itself when you're in court, just as justice might suggests itself for use. So it looks similar, but in reality, it's radically different. Why? Justice is aimed at the good of the soul. If you're guilty of something, you ought to be punished. That's what right? That's what's good for your soul. And justice will ensure that that happens. Whereas rhetoric, right, by contrast, I should say, rhetoric is not aimed at the good of your soul. It's aimed at pleasure, both for yourself and for your audience. And so let's say you did corrupt the youth, right? Let's say you're guilty of that. Well, if we were exercising justice here, you would be punished. You should be exiled and paid, pay the penalty and blah, 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 and so on. But if you're going to use rhetoric, what are you going to do? You're going to devise a fancy speech that pleases the jury so that you produce a more pleasant result for yourself, which is, namely, being found not guilty. Being punished, paying the penalty, is painful. That's not pleasant. Rhetoric is aimed at producing a pleasant result for yourself by producing pleasant speeches for the jurors. And so rhetoric, it looks like the kind of thing you should be using in a court. And so it kind of looks like justice, but in reality, it's radically different because it's aimed not at the good of your soul. In fact, it's inimical to the good of your soul in most cases. It's aimed not at the good of your soul, it's aimed at pleasure. That's the sense in which rhetoric is an image of justice. And so now, rhetoric is a knack, it's not a craft. Check, got it, right? You just learn these tricks. You don't know why they work, but they do. And okay, fine, right? You learn that, rule of three, people like it. You say things in threes, it's got a pleasant effect on the audience. Check. Rhetoric is an image of the craft of justice. It looks like it, but in reality, it's totally different because it's not aimed at the good of the soul. It's aimed at pleasure. Check. That's Socrates' account of rhetoric. And so we can see the vast differences between what Socrates is saying and what Gorgias had said. And it's very clear from what Socrates has said that he takes a rather dim view of rhetoric, that his view of rhetoric is by and large negative. That's what Polus is going to pick up on.